Okay, part two. Part two will go into the more of the Lavin and Schultz chapter. Lavin and Schultz is a little more subtle than Diamond. There's a number of points of agreement, but they tend to have quite a bit more nuance, I believe, a little more complicated, less fun, but perhaps more accurate. I want to start off with the definition of what it means to domesticate and what we're actually talking about. There's a lot of different approaches. People have had different ideas about how exactly to determine if an animal is domesticated or not. The way I prefer to talk about domestication is that during this period, human beings began to open up different pathways of interaction, different things that they were doing with between humans, animals, and plants. And so what this does is it changes the relationship, or it sets into motion certain processes so that you have this coevolution. And you see that a little bit in the film that we just watched, that there's a kind of a package of things that certain plants and animals start to go together. People become dependent upon the plants and animals, but the plants and animals in turn often become dependent upon people to reproduce and to thrive. And so it introduces a number of changes into this relationship, and it plays out differently in different parts of the world, as we'll see. The one thing, I guess, for me, and having done some reading in different areas, I like to be careful about using the typical terms that are used for domestication, or that humans, you may have heard this in the film, that humans are controlling nature. And I guess I would say to this, that human beings are definitely relating to their plants and animals in different ways, but they're not in control of things. They're trying to do things, but animals have their own things that they want to do. And plants, or anyone who's ever tried to successfully raise a garden or a farm, knows that there's a lot of things that you try to do that don't come out exactly right. I also want to avoid, again, this comes up in the textbook, but the idea of interference also implies that somehow the humans are the unnatural part of the equation, that we are somehow different from all the rest of the creatures in here. And so I would just like to caution you about these terms, because the terms themselves are part of that idea that humans pulled themselves out of and away from being natural during this stage of domestication. So I think that especially when we look back at how domestication happened, it didn't inevitably set in motion that we would end up here in the 20th century with laptops and refrigerators. There are plenty of societies that use these plants and animals in different ways and evolved in different forms with their plants and animals. It didn't always, and especially back in the day, it didn't set in motion the kinds of technological ideas that we have about our scientific approach to domestication that we saw in the film and we see in our science labs. So I want to go through kind of those typical journalistic questions of how, when, why, where, who, what. We'll start with how domestication occurred. How did this transformation begin to happen? There are a number of different ideas about this. Lavin and Schultz say that some people talk about this as not a conscious decision, that it kind of starts, they call this mutualism, where the plants and the animals find it beneficial and the humans do, but there's not any, you don't know that this is happening. It just starts to happen, and people then maybe realize it over time, but they don't really understand what's going on. Other people are less comfortable with that approach, because it takes away the fact that the people who were doing this were very conscious of their environment. They were very attuned to the plants and animals that they were manipulating. And so to say that this was simply they were, kind of stupidly stumbling along and happened to do this, takes away from the fact that many of the people who were doing this were being very smart about consciously trying to create these changes and to create the kinds of conditions that would encourage the plants and animals that they wanted to thrive. a lot of the, especially of the plants that we see, some of the things that happen is that there are what we might call, and I put beneficial in quotes because there are mutations that are good if you're being a domesticated plant, but would be disastrous if you were trying to live in the wild. So certain mutations in the wheat, for example, would be very bad or maladaptive if it were in wild conditions. But in the process where human beings are harvesting and then planting it again, it becomes a good mutation, which makes it a favorable crop. As we saw in the film, some of the husks and kernels that are softer and more tasty for human beings would be selected, even if in the wild that would not be something that you would want to have. And so Levin and Schultz give us a term that was introduced to us back in this section on biological evolution, but it becomes perhaps even more important during the domestication phase, is that people began to build, it's not just a domestication of certain specific plants and animals, it's a whole construction of a way of life around, or a whole ecology around a certain set of plants and animals. And so this is a slow process, but what happens is as we saw with biological evolution, it then changes the conditions of selection for the next generation. So that traits that, again, may have been not adaptive for other conditions become adaptive in this constructed environment. So in some ways, agriculture is a way in which humans and domestication are starting to ratchet up their niche construction abilities, or their ways in which they are changing the environment, not always for the good. A lot of these experiments failed and resulted in some burned out land areas. We saw this in the last class, so I'll be quick about it. How these food systems emerged historically or in history. Long period of gathering and hunting, maybe some scavenging. And as we talked about, this hunting and gathering pattern is the way that humans spread all over the world. After that, the first thing that happens is the plants. Those are the first thing that come into domestication. And from there, you have more intensification of the plants. And after that, you then have some societies that develop herding or pastoralism, but always in interaction with agricultural societies, and often kind of together with, as a package, as we saw in the film. In this, in the last class, we focused on the hunters and gatherers. In this class, we're focusing on this area between hunting and gathering and some of the first emergence of, especially of plant domestication. Since the beginning, the question of why people did this has always been on the minds of anthropologists and archaeologists. In the film, they concentrate on the area that we know the most about, perhaps, which is the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, this area in the Eastern Mediterranean. And this has traditionally been the place where, if we were talking about agriculture, people would say, well, that's where it is. Because those are the crops that we see, like wheat and, like, as we saw in the film, pigs and sheep, those kind of goats. Those all come from this area of the world, some of our most famous crops in the West and in Europe. And they spread from this area into other places. A lot of people have tried to find what are called one motor or single cause ideas about agriculture. But as we delve into the archaeology of this area, people have questioned whether there was a single cause even in this Middle Eastern region. And as we'll see, there are all kinds of other different areas in the world in which agriculture occurs. So it calls into question whether there was a single cause of agriculture. The other thing I want to point out here, and it is that as Levin and Schultz say, oftentimes horticulture or agriculture is said to be the same thing as settling down or sedentism. And it actually is not necessarily the case that you have to have agriculture in order to be settled down. As one of you put it, you could actually have a settled society based on salmon. And that's kind of a wild crop. In the Pacific Northwest, they had village life and settled society, but not necessarily based on agriculture. So it doesn't necessarily have to go together. And it's also often the case that what we call the settling down or the sedentism comes before domestication of the crops. So typically we think of, oh, people started planting things and then they settled down. It seems to be in a lot of cases, people started settling in different areas first before the domestication occurred. So it's called into question some of these ideas that there was a single cause that led to agriculture. And this leads us to this kind of world map. Levin and Schultz point out to us about 5 or 6 major areas of plant and animal domestication. So in Asia, of course, you see that's where we get rice. In the Middle East, we were just talking about that, the wheat, the goats, but also in Western Africa, in South America, the potato, the llama, and in what is now Central America or the area around Mexico, you have various maize and corn and beans and squashes. All of these areas independently started domesticating things. So, sometimes when we read Diamond, it's like he's only talking about one area. There were actually more areas than this. These are the major areas. Some people have said there are as many as 15 different areas of the world where the people in that area started to domesticate the things that were around them. Again, these were sophisticated societies who understood the natural world and were interested in changing their conditions or opening up new ideas and possibilities. And so this leads to what I think is one of the most interesting parts of Lavin and Schultz. They're borrowing on the work of Melinda Zeter and Smith, 2 archaeologists who have kind of done a lot of work trying to figure out what do these areas, is there something that these areas of the world have in common? And one of the things is that there's, this all happens in a period of time from about, 15,000 years ago to about 10,000, 9,000 years ago. So it all happens in the same time period. And so people have speculated, is it climate change? Is it population pressures? Is it resource imbalances? Did it all happen at the same time for a reason? And these archaeologists, they say that they don't think that there was one single cause. And so what they actually posit, and it's a really interesting idea, is that what they say is that in various parts of the world, people were trying different things out. They call auditioning, kind of like you try out for theater. And so what they were trying to do is combine things in different ways. And they were seeing what would work in different parts of the world based on what was there and what they had at hand. And what these archaeologists tell us, which again is super interesting and would go against not only Diamond, but all kinds of ideas that we have about the necessity of agriculture, is that during the first stages of domestication, they don't see any evidence that there was population pressure. So people were being creative, doing different things in these areas. And at least according to them, they don't really see this kind of feedback loop between population pressure and the need for domestication. Again, this is perhaps not, there's still a lot of debate about exactly what happened, but I'm kind of persuaded by these archaeologists in terms of of how they think about human creativity in terms of what they were doing. Again, this leads us back into the question of what plants and animals were candidates for domestication, or what kinds of things could be domesticated. And on page 213 of Lavin and Schultz, they give us a different kind of map or chart about the different major areas of domestication. I always like to draw a big line between the stuff on the left, or I guess in the left, and from your point of view, the stuff on the left of the chart, which all comes from the Americas, and the stuff on the right, which all comes from Africa and Eurasia. And the reason I like to draw a line in there and sort of highlight that these are two different areas of the world is that all the people in Africa and Eurasia were for 10,000 years in contact and trading with each other. To a lesser extent, the people in the Americas were in contact, but there wasn't, for about 10,000 years, sustained contact between these two areas of the world. And so on the one hand, in Eurasia, you have the domestication, the candidates for domestication of some of these large domesticated animals, such as cows and horses. And in the Americas, you have the domestication of lots of different plants, some of our best plants, but very few, maybe only the llama, in terms of large domesticated animals. And so when these two worlds come back together, when they come back together about 500 years ago, they enter the picture with a very different domestication schema here. So this is an important realization about what was available in different parts of the world to be domesticated. So what does it all mean, or why should we care? So what? There's three sets of consequences that Lavin and Schultz talk about in terms of agriculture. Some of these we've basically seen in Diamond. I think they're a little less, they're a little more nuanced than Diamond's work, but some of them are fairly similar. They talk about the possibilities of increasing your population, that in some ways it's a trade-off of getting more food, but you get less quality of the nutrients in food, that it increases your labor time, it can increase diseases, and they even give you the same example of the height difference between the skeletons in Greece between the hunter-gatherers and then when they developed agriculture. So they kind of parallel here some of the things that Diamond talks about in terms of the consequences of domestication. They also note that there's no way that people who are domesticating these things could have thought about the kind of the long-term multi-generational consequences as they were living their lives. There's a second set of consequences which have to do with the world today. And this is kind of, I think, worth reflecting upon, is that almost all the things that we actually eat are the same things that people domesticated 10,000 years ago. Although that film gives you the example of a scientist doing their scientist thing, you don't go down to the grocery store and they're like, hey, we have this new domesticated food for you. They might bring in another food from another part of the world that we didn't know about, but there have been very few new domesticates. And so all the places that have agriculture, it was imported from other places that already had it. And so it wasn't, for example, Australia, there wasn't any domestication. They lived in hunting and gathering. When the Europeans showed up in Australia, it wasn't like they're like, aha, you can domesticate this and you can domesticate that. You just didn't know about it. No, they didn't have any candidates for domestication. So they brought in, at the present time, there's a lot of wheat and stuff grown in Australia, but that was all brought from elsewhere. So the main food crops that we see and the main animals were all done by people thousands of years ago. And so, you know, I keep waiting for the new domesticate, but it's not happening. These are the things that they were able to do before. We started talking about this a little bit, but the fact that in Eurasia, you had these big domesticated animals, and in the Americas, you really didn't, helps to explain that when these two areas come back into contact about 500 years ago, that they're going to have a differential in terms of what they were used to. So in Eurasia, they were very used to riding horses, using them for war, for plowing, for these kinds of things. This was not something that was done in the Americas. And so it was very transformative to actually, the people native to the Americas quickly figured out that horses were valuable, and they started buying and stealing them and then incorporating them into their own lives quickly. But at the first, it was new. The other thing is that most of the major diseases, smallpox and various plagues that swept across Eurasia and killed millions of people over time, they were deadly plagues, but they also meant that the people in Eurasia had certain resistances to these kinds of plagues. Whereas in the Americas, they had very few domesticated animals, and so they didn't have the same level of plagues. They weren't familiar with smallpox, and so both biologically and culturally, they didn't know what to do with the smallpox and the kinds of ways that that spread and was fatal for many people in the Americas. It was often fatal for Europeans and Asians as well, but over time they had developed both ideas about what you do when smallpox comes to town, which is burn everything and shut your town down and don't visit anybody. And they had also developed some forms of biological resistance simply from exposure over time. Now, again, this would result in, as we know, the decimation of some of the American populations, and the fact that we're here speaking English or speaking Spanish in most of the Americas is a result of that imbalance of power. Eventually, if you look at that food revolution, the food revolution box in Lavin and Schultz, the crops from the Americas would become hugely globally important. Potatoes, corn, hard to imagine Italian food without tomatoes, but in fact, before the Americas came into the picture, all these tomatoes and spices and chili peppers and things like that all came from the Americas and then were taken around the world. Oh, tobacco too, can't forget that. The third set of consequences, third and last, is that when you have these kinds of production of food that becomes stable, at least to a certain extent, of course, there are crises and droughts and these things, but if you can produce food for more people and then begin to separate people based on social class and occupation, it allows for new and different forms of social, as Lavin and Schultz put it, social complexity to arise. And so what it makes possible are different things that probably would not have been possible without being able to produce food and store that food, and then to be able to produce more weapons and people who are using them. So it is with agriculture that we see that it is then possible to have more concentrated populations in urban areas. You can make large buildings and public works, leading to different ways of recording what's going on and labeling things and taxing them. So writing monuments and of course being able to support an army and a territory and defend a territory. So that's what we're going to be talking about in the second part of the chapter, are these different forms of political and social organization that began to arise after the domestication of plants and animals. Not everywhere, not in every society. It's not inevitable. It's not that once you start growing wheat, you're automatically going to develop a stratified society, but it did make it possible in different parts of the world, and it led to different forms of political organization than what we had seen before with the band organization of the hunters and gatherers.